Okay, today's second half of the lecture is about a research seminar that I presented last year at a major innovation conference called ASIALICS. And the title is the historical development and ascendancy of family-owned business conglomerates in Korea, Chaebol, as an adaptation to cultural transaction costs, implications for new models of startup-driven innovation, a seminar that I presented in collaboration with Dr. Jang Hyun Kim, also of Sungkyunkwan Kwan University. The outline of this seminar will start with the history and development of Chaebols, the theory of the firm, which is a well-established theory in business school, some of you may be familiar with, the establishment of business ecosystems, which we discussed with respect to Silicon Valley and Startup Nation in Israel. Transaction costs, another important concept in business school, which is related to, as applied to ecosystems and open innovation. And then zoom in more specifically on what I call cultural transaction costs, and therefore Chaebol development as an adaptation to cultural transaction costs. And finally, close the seminar with implications for startup-driven innovation. So what is a Chaebol? Well, you're familiar with many of them, Samsung, Hyundai, SK, LG, Lotte, and many others. These are household names in Korea, and in fact, some of them are names well known globally. So a Chaebol is a combination of the Korean word che for wealth and bol for clan or clique. And the two characteristics of Chaebol are that it's family owned and it is subsidiaries across diverse industries. So as well known is Chaebols dominate South Korea's economy. They have subsidiaries in a range of sectors centered around the founding family that maintains control over the group's core assets. And so if we look at the total capitalization of companies in South Korea, the Chaebol take up about 3/4 of the total market capitalization, with Samsung alone around 41%. So they are a huge part of the economy, and they are very successful and dominant in the Korean economy. And there have been many theories, controversies, positive, negative, etc., why this is the case. Some people think it's good, some people think it's bad. The purpose of this seminar is not to comment on the goodness or the badness of this. It is just the fact that they are very dominant, and this curious observation, why are they so dominant? There have been many forces against Chaebols trying to reduce their power, reduce their influence, and generally not very successful. So there is some factor that is not just size. Big companies fail all the time in the West, but some factor that makes these Chaebols very important and very successful in the Korean economy. So some of the development as they grew in the early days, favorable treatment from the government, military takeover and dictatorship, oligopolization, expansion of the business, economic crisis, economic backbone, and so forth. There's been so much history and so much events, and somehow the Chaebols still persist. So what's interesting also is that the Chaebols have persisted and succeeded in Korea when Western conglomerates, diversified conglomerates, have basically diminished and decreased. And so one of the interesting things is that if you look at the performance of a company as it grows, so you can see we're starting to relate to the theory of the firm, what is the optimal size of a company, and so forth. The performance increases as you get more scale and more abilities and so forth. But at a certain point, the performance goes down. Uh, and that's one of the reasons why conglomerates, as we'll see shortly, have not been so sustained in Western economies. And in fact, conglomerates are kind of almost given a discount. People don't like conglomerates. With the private equity, they break up the conglomerates into individual companies, much more capable, much more nimble, much more acting faster, and so forth. And so you get a lot of organizational complexity and rise of administrative costs that eventually exceed the gains from economies of scale and scope. And so at that point, the performance goes down. Korean chaebols don't seem to be affected by this. So if we look at the diversification level of companies, if we go 1980, the diversification has gone down. In fact, one of the themes of business consulting and business excellence has been focus on the core competency, focus, focus, focus. And companies that focus in the Western economies are more successful than companies that don't focus. And so diversification is in some ways not good for most companies. Now, I talked about 3M, for example, has a many diversified product portfolio, many different products, but that's a little bit different. It's not really a diversified company. It's a focused company on those sorts of materials, adhesives, and other technologies, but it makes many products based on that focus. So 3M, we wouldn't call it a diversified conglomerate. Samsung, for example, has insurance, has construction, has electronics, has life sciences. I mean, that is totally diversified and not really possible in Western companies. Those companies would be broken apart, split up, and more value and more effectiveness results. Now, if we look at internal transactions are significant at these chaebols. So Samsung is 41% of the market capitalization. All that business takes place, obviously, not just outside Samsung, but a lot of that money and a lot of that value is created inside Samsung. In other words, transactions among affiliates, in other words, the subsidiaries, make up 12% of total trading by large business groups. And then there's issues of corruption and all this kind of stuff. That's not my concern here. My point is that the internal transactions among these companies are very significant. So, for example, when Samsung builds a fabrication factory for Samsung Electronics for the chips, Samsung Engineering, Samsung Construction is the company that makes that building. And that's what we call about internal transactions. So here's some questions. Is government influence the main driver of chaebol growth? How do we explain the persistence of chaebols in the face of the 1987 democracy movement, the IMF crisis in 1997, and recent anti-chaebol reform efforts? In other words, we've had tremendous crises in Korean history, but the chaebols still exist, and in fact, they continue to grow. So how do we explain chaebol's strength in the face of countervailing drivers, in other words, drivers that break apart these companies that exist with conglomerates in Western economies? So now we go to theory of the firm. Why does a company exist? Well, there are several theories of the firm. One is about profit, and these are various academics that have published on these theories and studied these theories. So one reason why the company exists is it organizes profit in the short run. Another theory of the firm is profits in the long run, optimizing theories. So the firm, the company makes certain activities more optimal. So for example, sales maximization, managerial theories, non-optimizing theory and behavioral theory. People just like to be together and so forth. They work better together. And so these are the theories of the firm. Probably the most important theory of the firm is that of transaction cost theory. In other words, a company has to have internal transaction costs. In other words, things like HR and finance and bureaucracy, and these are the internal transaction costs. And then the company also has external transaction costs. So for example, it might get outside lawyers. Of course, it has customers and so forth. So the company forms, this is the theory of the firm, when the internal transaction costs are less than the external transaction costs. So for example, you are a small startup, one person startup, and you need to create some contracts, for example, with a venture capital firm or whatever, legal contracts. The way to do that is you hire, not hire, but you work with an outside lawyer. And then you pay that outside lawyer. You have to make a contract with the outside lawyer to make a contract with the venture capital firm. So you have some external transaction costs. But if you get bigger, then you might have your own lawyer in your company. You might have your own legal department. Of course, big companies, medium-sized companies, they have their own lawyers. They have their own legal department because the internal transaction costs of having your own lawyer and control of that are less than the external transaction costs. And so when the internal transaction costs are less than the external transaction costs, that provides an incentive to create that company. That's the basic concept of transaction cost theory. So if we look at this a little more abstractly, when we have these transaction costs, you can do everything with all network when the external transaction costs are low and the internal transactions, the cost of ownership are high, or you can do everything inside the company when the external transaction costs are quite high and the internal transaction costs are lower, the green line here. So all in the company or all basically networked. So this is transaction cost theory and why companies exist. So what is a business ecosystem? We talked about business ecosystems as being extremely important for innovation, and they are, of course, important for actual business. So you have your core business, you have your extended enterprise, and you have the business ecosystem. And one of the arguments we had made, or points we had made, was that Silicon Valley and Israel have very mature, very extensive business ecosystems to support innovation. So the open innovation transaction costs related to relationship networks and multiplexity. So you have relationships and interactions, like we talked about, to make innovation, to make a company work. You work with lawyers, you work with accountants, you work with banks, you work with designers, you work with manufacturers, and so forth. And this is multi-layered network theory. And you can have high multiplexity, medium multiplexity, and low multiplexity. So where your friendship network and your advice network is all inside, and low multiplexity is when these many networks are separate. So now let's talk about cultural transaction costs, which is not mentioned very often. When we make a transaction, when we go to the store and buy something, there's a transaction cost. We have to travel there, that's a cost. We have to give some money, that's a cost. And we have to spend some time, that's a cost. Generally, we don't talk about cultural transaction costs, going to the store and being able to speak the same language and to be able to trust them and to interact with the store. That's kind of taken for granted. That just happens. But there is a cultural transaction cost. And so if you are not comfortable going to the store, if the store people don't like you, or you just feel prejudiced or something, some sort of barrier to culturally interacting with that store, that's a transaction cost. So transaction costs, we have search and information costs, bargaining and decision costs, policing and enforcement costs. So transaction costs are very broad. And what I say is that cultural transaction costs are extremely important as well. And as you may know, the famous business guru, Peter Drucker, said culture eats strategy for breakfast. So he was a strategy consultant, and maybe most famous strategy consultant business. You might have heard about him, maybe even read some of his books. And even though he's a strategy consultant, he says culture is even more important. So let's look a little bit about Chaebol development, therefore, as an adaptation to cultural transaction costs in Korea. So here's a presentation by a good friend of mine, Joseph Cabby. He's a professor at SUNY, and he summarizes, of course, simplification, 5 core characteristics of Korean people, Korean culture. One is that of uri. Uri means community focused. The other one is soyo, is a seniority system. Uh, Kunmyon, which means hardworking, diligent. Chaemyeon, face saving. People don't want to be embarrassed and uncomfortable. And more recently, pali pali, which is a sense of urgency. So in Korea, we have a sense of uri, togetherness, soyol, sense of seniority and hierarchy, kunmyon, hardworking, chaemyeon, shame culture, and pali pali, sense of urgency. And Korean culture and culture anywhere is very important, as Peter Drucker said. And we're going to see how these factors relate. So here's some other cultures. We talked about Rome, Rome and open innovation. They reduced the transaction costs for other people to come to Rome and bring their ideas. And we talked about innovation in Rome. The Dutch were also very prominent around the world. They went into Indonesia, they went into South America, and the Dutch were very influential uh, in terms of making connections and making business around the world. The Dutch East India Company, for example. And then, of course, Singapore. Singapore, the city state, is part of the Malaysian peninsula, but it's a very unique culture. It integrates English, Chinese, Indian, and Malaysian together. And Singapore is a hub for finance and trade and innovation in Southeast Asia and globally. So they seem to have reduced a lot of the cultural transaction costs and hence very successful in doing business in many places in the world and generating value. And of course, the example of cultural transaction costs is the United States, where many cultures can come together and interact. So one of the concepts is that in Korean culture, it is very difficult to randomly and easily interact outside your established network. In fact, technically speaking, the language is designed, or I should say, the language, when you talk to other people, you need to know your relationship to other people in order to talk to them properly. In Korea, we call it chondetmal and panmal and so forth. And different ways of talking to different people are based on what your relationship with them is. So that makes it very complex and introduces a cultural transaction cost to random interactions among people. Of course, it's possible. And of course, you can guess and you can decide to use chondetmal with everybody or whatever. But it's, as we say in Korean, a little bit isangheo, or a little bit strange. It's not comfortable. And that lack of comfort is a cultural transaction cost. So what the chaebol are essentially is a way of internalizing and creating a community where you can engage comfortably in people that are in literally your own community and well-established relationship patterns. So we said that the chaebol are family owned. And of course, everyone in the chaebol is not part of the family biologically, but they are a kind of family together. And so it is more comfortable to go from, if Samsung Electronics needs insurance for something, business insurance, they go to Samsung Insurance, Samsung Fire and Marine, Samsung Hwaje to get their insurance. It's part of the family. So the cultural transaction cost is much easier. It's not so easy for someone from Samsung to just go to some other company and walk in and say, I would like to do some business with you. That is just very strange. And we call that a cultural transaction cost. That is not so strange in the Roman experience, in the Dutch experience, in the American experience, and in the Singaporean experience. There are no sort of barriers or issues to just talking to people like this outside your network. In Korean culture, you have to have a network or an introduction. Of course, we talk about that in China as well, relationship driven in Asia in general. So that's a major phenomenon in Asia, well known, but it's a very especially extreme in Korea. So the chaebol essentially are a way to overcome this. If you need to work with somebody outside your area, but you want to be in the same network, in the same family, you work within the chaebol. Now, of course, Samsung doesn't do everything, so it does go outside of its network, but not easily. And Samsung is famous for not doing a lot of mergers and acquisitions and partnerships and things like that. Generally, they either don't work with outsiders or they acquire them and somehow bring them into the totally and bring them into the system and part of the Samsung family, if you will. So that is a concept of chaebol development as an adaptation to cultural transaction costs related to the theory of the firm and to transaction costs more generally. So, what are some of the implications for startup driven growth? So, what's interesting is that we've mentioned about the chaebols having most of the market capitalization, but they have much less of the employment. And this is a central problem socially, is that small and medium sized enterprises are almost 90% of the employment, but they are only 20% of the capitalization. So how do we, shift that? And it's related again to this cultural transaction costs. So instead of lowering internal transaction costs, one way is to lower the external transaction costs. So these individual startups find it very difficult to grow because they don't have a network, they don't have a business ecosystem outside, and there are transaction costs to do that. Whereas the big chaebol have solved that problem. They don't need to have external transaction costs because all they are internal transaction costs. So if we want to make startups successful, we should make it easier for them to interact with outside entities. Just like in Silicon Valley and just like in Startup Nation, it's very easy for those startups to create a kind of a network. They don't have to be a big company to act like a big company. So how can we do this without suffering a cultural revolution? Uh, in China, there was the Cultural Revolution, very controversial point, and Chinese business has gotten easier to make these outside arrangements. It doesn't have chaebol or these diversified conglomerates are not as significant in China. So aspects of their external transaction costs have been reduced. So a key way to do this is through some form of global engagement. In other words, if these startups can be like Rome, small city state, or if they can be like Singapore, or if they can be like Venice, engaging easily with outside and have government policies to increase that and reduce those external transaction costs, then the startups and the small companies can be like Chaebol without becoming Chaebol. So these are some of the important implications. So in summary, we talked about the history and development of chaebols, how they got so big in Korea, but not so big in other economies. The theory of the firm, why does the company exist? Business ecosystems, which are very important for any kind of business as well as innovation, and the transaction costs related to that, cultural transaction costs, and chaebol development as an adaptation to cultural transaction costs in Korea and some implications for startup driven growth. So I'll finish with a closing thought. The fourth industrial revolution people have talked about. And what is the fourth industrial revolution? Well, interestingly enough, there isn't really a key definition. That might be because we are not historians, we are living in the fourth industrial revolution. But if we look at the previous revolutions, the first one was essentially the steam engine, the beginning of the industrial revolution, the first industrial revolution. The second was electricity as sort of the key core technology. The third was computers. And now the fourth industrial revolution is not a single technology, but in fact, technology convergence and cross innovation. In other words, it's not AI, it's not robots. Uh, it is combination of many technologies, life sciences, AI, robots, uh, internet technologies, and so forth, coming together. You can summarize them as cyber physical systems, whatever. But the fourth industrial revolution is defined by technology convergence. What is the implications of this? In other words, that combining different companies together is going to be important, not just for success, but in fact is the definition of the world we are living in now. So we can create more innovation by encouraging more connections among different companies, different technologies. It's not just a luxury, but it will become a necessity for this fourth industrial revolution. So that's the seminar for today. Any questions?
All clear.
Any questions? Chilmon Simika?
No question?
No question.
No, Professor.
So does this make sense? What do you think about cultural transaction costs? Because the last couple lectures we talked about culture, right? So this is not just a theoretical argument, but it's related to, how companies work, how companies are successful, and if you want to do innovation, if you want to manage innovation, culture is going to be extremely important. So we need to learn from that, and so forth. Now, I want to make one last comment, which is extremely important, very important. We live in a world where there's increasing nationalism and increasing sort of fragmentation. Now, I'm not going to make political statement, but I'm talking about the reality. We have, Donald Trump with America First. The Chinese are, talking about their system is the best. Here in Korea, K-pop, K this, K that, Korea is the best. There is no one best culture. That's a meaningless statement, a meaningless question. But I will say this, the best way to success is in openness to all cultures. The best companies take the best, just like from different places, just like Rome became the Roman Empire. It took the best things from different areas. So as soon as Korea and Korean government says everything Korean is the best and we are the best and everybody should be like Korean and Korea is the best and all that kind of stuff, that is the beginning of the end of success. That is the beginning of the end of innovation. I'll give you an example. In the 1980s, this is before some of you were born, Japanese companies were very successful. Sony, Toshiba, all this. And American companies, including Donald Trump, by the way, he was very traumatized by this back in the 1980s and 1990s, were very afraid. And there were a lot of books about the Japanese way. The Japanese was the best. Everybody has to follow the Japanese management system. Of course, that didn't turn out to be true. And nobody thinks about that. Not that the Japanese are doing bad things, but that concept of only the Japanese way as being the best way and the magic to success was false. And so when I talk about this seminar and Chaebols, it's not saying it's bad or good. It is just an adaptation, a way to success for the Korean culture. But if you want to be globally successful and you truly want to innovate, your mindset that the Chinese is the best way, and I'm Chinese, so I'm going to do it the Chinese way, that is a recipe not for success, but a recipe for the opposite. And the same goes true the American way and so forth. Those who are the most successful will be open-minded to different things and be able to bring together the best from all different worlds. So that's very important to keep in mind. Any thoughts, comments?
Professor,
Yeah.
I like your comments, but actually, I always wondering this kind of rising nationalism.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I feel like many, I can say my country, many politicians or business people can make profit from this kind of statement.
Yes.
But I have a small thoughts. I think it's like I feel if like the government exists, it's like from our history like worldwide, but I feel like this kind of statement will always exist. How do you think that? Like I feel like if
Yeah,
once
so you're exactly right. So here's one interesting comment on that. This is a course about innovation, right? This is not
yes
a course about politics. It's not a course about government policies. I mean, it's related to that, but it's not a course about how to become elected president. And so, of course, there are forces that are actually against innovation. There are forces to keep a country unified or to keep people together and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying those are bad either. Not everybody can be innovative. So if you have a politician that says everybody has to be Chinese only, and I'm going to get elected because I'm Chinese only, and everyone likes that, and everyone feels good about that, that's okay. I'm not saying it's good or whatever, but my point is that serves a purpose. But if that same politician says we're going to be innovative and we're going to be globally successful because we are this way, that doesn't make sense. You see what I mean? So
yes
not everybody can. For example, I'm reading a biography now on Galileo. Everybody knows Galileo, right? He Galileo's principle of inertia. He saw the moons of Jupiter. He saw the sunspots and etc. So I'm in the middle of the book on Galileo, and they are questioning him by the Roman Catholic Church. They're saying you said things that are against the Bible, so we are going to punish you. And it's crazy because the Bible, in this case, about the sun being at the center and so on and so forth, the Bible was not correct. And in fact, in 1992, the Catholic Church took back this, punishment, and it was very embarrassing. But the point is, back in 1615, when they were punishing Galileo, the Catholic Church was suffering from the Protestant Reformation. So the Catholic Church was under stress, and people were, basically there was a risk that the Catholic Church could fall apart and too much opposition. So they had they had other concerns, and Galileo was a victim of that. The Catholic Church wasn't being innovative. They weren't being scientists. They weren't even being correct, but they had to preserve themselves. And so they did the punishment. Uh, and so these things will happen. And you are in an innovation class. So you will have forces against your innovation. And it doesn't necessarily mean those are evil or bad forces. They are what they are. You know, Catholic Church needs to survive. Chinese state needs to survive for various reasons, right? And so there's a world beyond innovation, of course. But if you want to innovate, which is very important, as I argue, and if China wants to innovate or the Catholic Church wants to innovate, it has to balance that as well. So it's very difficult. These are very challenging things. Innovation is not just about a checklist and equations and, okay, I'm innovative. I got an A in Dr. Gurel's class, so I'm an innovator. It's just not that easy. It's a lifelong passion, lifelong process. And some people even pay with their lives or get punished for the innovation. It's very difficult.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for your point. Any other comments or questions?
Professor, do you think that nationalism will stop innovation or influence to it?
Well, it's not so simple. I think at a very high level, very general level, I think yes, simply because innovation requires diversity from what I have been presenting. And so to the extent that you limit diversity, you will have an effect on innovation. Now, my answer is not categorically yes, because innovation is also about passion and improvement. And if the nationalism comes with a certain passion, for example, the president of some country says, send us your ideas to improve life, and so forth. So and that's important, and I'll give tax benefits, blah, blah, blah. So people will do more innovation around that. Sure, why not? But in general, I think it will inhibit innovation. And usually those ultra nationalist countries will end up not progressing.
Yes.
Thank you. Any other comments, thoughts?
Some question.
Yeah.
So, what do you think? How can we just bring innovation into a country which is quite custom oriented, or like too much focused on internal development of
Yeah,
work?
that's right. So that's a real challenge. I think it's a total mindset thing. To be very honest, I really don't have an answer to that, because I've seen that here in Korea. It's very internally focused. And I actually think what's interesting is a lot of the success of Korea has happened because of older generation that was actually very outgoing and was forced to be outgoing. What happens in a lot of societies, not just Korea, of course, is when they get successful and comfortable, then there are less incentives to be innovative. So a lot of young people in Korea, not all, of course, but it's not always so easy, and there's unemployment and so forth. But in reality, Korea is very advanced, very developed. There's a good healthcare. There's cafe in every corner, and nice coffee and nice restaurants and everything. So a lot of things in the nation are very comfortable. And so this issue of how to create this desire and passion for creating new things when everything is reasonable and okay is very difficult. I don't have the answer to that, but it's a major challenge. Not just Korea, but as you mentioned, with many countries, when they achieve a certain level of success, then there's less incentive to really push innovation. We saw that with the Roman Empire. So after a while, Rome didn't have that same engagement. They got more internally focused. And of course, the Roman Empire fell. Any other comments, questions? Last point before we close. How many of you would like to have a question answer period with Dan Cohen? My colleague Dan Cohen with Flight, which won second in the world in the Entrepreneurship Cup.
That would be very interesting. Yes, please.
Okay, so I'd like to make this, I want to plan on that. I'd like you to, maybe I'll put this on, I'll send an email, not on LMS. It's not an official assignment, but I'll send an email to all of you and ask for your questions, what kind of questions you'd like to ask. And maybe we can organize something efficient for him and for you for some of your key questions. Sounds like a plan?
Yes.
Yes.
And,
Yep.
yeah, and then what we can do is we'll set up a question and answer and select some of those questions for him to answer for the whole class. So I'll send an email after this class about that.
Thank you.